I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart of a king, and of a king of England too.
Hello everyone. It is time for a new history class, and in this video I'm going to tell you about the life of one of the most famous women in history, and a remarkable sovereign too, sometimes called the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth I of England. And I have a special guest for this video, WhispersRed ASMR, who I'm sure you already know about if you are familiar with the ASMR community. If not, I can only recommend you to check her channel. The link is in the description, and she has been kind enough to lend her voice to read some quotes from Elizabeth or attributed to her that you will hear here and there in this video. I hope you like that kind of collaboration, because I plan to make other ones in the next few weeks with other ASMR YouTubers I appreciate. But it's now time for our journey to the past to begin. So I invite you to adopt a comfortable position. You can close your eyes. I'm going to show you a few images, but you can just let the sound of my voice guide you through the life of the Virgin Queen. And our story begins almost 500 years ago in 1533 with the birth of Elizabeth. She was a daughter of King Henry VIII and his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Among other things, the reign of Henry VIII is much remembered for the king's appetite for women. He had 6 wives and many more mistresses during his life. And it is also under Henry VIII that the Church of England was separated from the authority of the Pope in Rome, partly due to a conflict with the Pope, who didn't want to recognize his divorce from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, that he wanted to get rid of, but also for political reasons, because the possibility for the king to choose bishops, to nominate bishops in England, gave him better control over the church. I'm talking about this religious question because the 16th century, just when Elizabeth was born, was a time of intense religious tensions in Europe. Protestantism had appeared initially in Germany and started to spread to the north of Europe, to Scandinavia, to Britain, to parts of France, and the Protestants rejected the authority of the Roman Catholic Church, the authority of the Pope, and rejected parts of the doctrine too, leading to many conflicts between countries and internally. By the end of Henry VIII's reign, in the 1530s and 1540s, the island of Great Britain had already been hit strongly by this Protestant wave. There were 2 kingdoms on the island of Great Britain back then, Scotland in the north and England. And in both kingdoms, the population was split between Roman Catholics, who remained faithful to the Pope and the authority of Rome, and Protestants. Elizabeth was raised in the Protestant faith during her childhood, and we will see later that this will be extremely important. But when she was only 2 years old, her mother, Anne Boleyn, was executed, beheaded by order of the king, on charges of conspiracy and adultery that were probably false. The truth is that Henry VIII wanted to get rid of her to be able to marry for the 3rd time. Elizabeth had a half-sister, Mary, that Henry VIII had with his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and shortly after the execution of Anne Boleyn, the two princesses were declared to be illegitimate. The king hoped to have a male heir that he hadn't had yet with his third wife, and he wanted to pave the way for this heir, avoiding a conflict when the succession would happen. And he finally had a son who survived childhood, Edward, with his third wife, Jane Seymour, and Edward became the official heir to the throne. So, during her childhood, Elizabeth, like her half-sister Mary, was just an illegitimate princess, and nobody would have seriously believed that she would rule the country one day. However, she received a very good education like any other royal child. She was taught history, religion in the Protestant faith, as I said before, many languages. She spoke perfect Italian and French, and dead languages such as Latin and Greek too. Like any princess of the Renaissance, she was also educated in arts, in particular music, in which she apparently excelled, based on testimonies. In 1547, when she was 14 only, her father died, and his successor, her half-brother Edward, this son that Henry VIII had with his third wife, Jane Seymour, was proclaimed the new king of England. Elizabeth was put under the care of her stepmother, the sixth and last wife of Henry VIII, Catherine Parr, and spent some time with Catherine Parr and her new husband. She had remarried after the death of the king in their home. We don't know every details for sure, but it's very likely that Catherine Parr's new husband, Thomas Seymour, assaulted her during this period. At least she was harassed. This probably contributed to change her personality, maybe making her tougher and more suspicious with men, which would certainly have an impact during the very long reign that would start a few years later.
God forgive you, but I never can.
In 1553, Elizabeth is now 20 years old, and her half-brother, King Edward VI, dies aged only 15 with no legal heir, which leads to a short succession crisis, but finally it is her older sister, Mary. You remember, Mary was the daughter of Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Mary becomes Queen Mary I. This is going to imply quite a lot of changes for England, and the reign of Mary I from 1553 to 1558 is going to be a particularly troubled period for the kingdom. First, because Edward was a Protestant, whereas Mary is a devout Catholic, and her obsession during her reign is going to be to reinstate Roman Catholicism in England, and she's going to strongly repress the Protestants, ordering hundreds of executions, which is why she is sometimes nicknamed Bloody Mary. Actually, during the 5 years reign of Mary I, England is in a state of religious civil war between Catholics and Protestants. She is the champion of the Catholic party. And in 1554, there is a Protestant attempt to dethrone her and replace her with Elizabeth. It is unclear to what extent Elizabeth was involved in this conspiracy, but actually it was discovered before. The leader of this conspiracy was captured and executed. Elizabeth was even sent to jail for a few weeks to the London Tower, and she was not released until she pledged allegiance to her sister, Queen Mary. Externally, too, England completely changed politics with Mary I. She wedded the King of Spain, Philip II. Back then, by the middle of the 16th century, Spain was the superpower in Europe. The country was extremely rich thanks to its fastly growing colonial empire in the Americas. It had a number of possessions, not only Spain as we know this country today, but also parts of Italy, the Netherlands and Belgium, and a close alliance with Austria that was ruled by the same family, the Habsburgs. Even though they were married, Philip II and Mary I never lived together. They only met to get married and then separated. But this alignment with Spain implied a war with the enemies of Spain, and in particular with France, that was the competing power against the Habsburgs. The war with France also meant war with Scotland. Scotland was a historic ally of France, and for 5 years England found itself at war, in a very costly war with countries it was at peace with before. This period turned out to be rather disastrous for the status of England, that for a period of time became a satellite of Spain, had internal troubles, and when Mary I died in 1558, a large part of the English population received the news with relief. Mary had no heir. The throne of England was vacant again, so Elizabeth appeared as the obvious successor. She had been declared to be illegitimate during her childhood, but so had Mary, and she had reigned. In 1559, Elizabeth becomes Queen of England. She is 25 years old, and her reign is going to last for 44 years. Out of all the issues that have accumulated during Bloody Mary's reign, the most urgent is the religious problem, and this is the first one Elizabeth is going to address in 1559.
There is only one Christ, Jesus, one faith. All else is a dispute over trifles.
Elizabeth was a Protestant, but she was also moderate and pragmatic. So during her first session in front of the English Parliament in 1559, she called for the passage of two acts, the so-called Act of Supremacy, that reinstates the independence of the Church of England, something her sister Mary had undone during her reign, and the Act of Uniformity that creates a single common prayer book for all of her subjects. And generally, during most of her reign, she's going to try to maintain peace between the Catholics and the Protestants. She also manages to quickly make peace with France. The war no longer makes sense now that England has recovered its independence from Spanish politics. And starting in the 1560s, a period of appeasement internally and externally is going to begin. It doesn't mean that England is entirely out of trouble. It's a kingdom with a young queen, which still has to impose her power and her legitimacy to a large part of her population. The prestige of England has reached a low. It is now considered to be a secondary power in Europe, and it's going to take her a lot of work to rebuild her kingdom's reputation. And the breakup with Rome, even though it makes sense religiously and in internal politics, also means that England remains isolated from great powers in Europe that happen to be Catholic countries like Spain or France or Austria. Elizabeth is a single woman. She is young. She becomes queen only at 25. And nobody knows that her reign is going to last for 44 years. So, especially in the first years of her reign, she has plenty of suitors, men who want to marry her, including with a lot of political intentions for a short period of time, Philip II of Spain, who was also the husband of her half-sister Mary before. She's going to reject each and every one of them, remaining single for the rest of her life and imposing this decision to everyone, from her court to her subjects.
I have already joined myself in marriage to a husband, namely the Kingdom of England.
Even though she never got married, Elizabeth very probably had a romantic life. She may have rejected people like the King of Sweden, or the future King of France, or the Archduke of Austria. But she was apparently involved in a relationship with a member of her court, Robert Dudley, and this relationship lasted for a very long time. We don't precisely know its nature, but there were many gossips back then about this relationship, and one day the wife of Robert Dudley died accidentally, leading to a lot of suspicion around the possible interference of Elizabeth in this accident. It is also known for a fact that when Robert Dudley remarried later, she showed a lot of discontent and he fell into disgrace for some time, even though contacts between the two never really stopped. Elizabeth may have been interested in having a relationship with a man, but certainly not in sharing power. She was ambitious enough and sure of herself enough to keep all the power for herself, and actually she used diplomatically the interest, be it romantic or more probably political, of her suitors, sometimes making them wait for a long time with no intention to say yes. Actually, she quickly began to cultivate the image of a woman married to her job, to her people, and in the first years of her reign, she also started to dramatically change her appearance on official portraits. Her new look was extremely fancy. She covered her face with extremely white makeup, making her appear very pale. These were the standards of beauty in this period of time, but she pushed it to an extreme, giving her almost the appearance of an ethereal creature, like a goddess. And it is her dedication to her job as a queen, her status of single queen, and this weird appearance she took that earned her this nickname, the Virgin Queen. During her entire reign, Elizabeth avoided as much as possible clashes with other countries, maintaining England away from European conflicts. And this period of stability, the absence of war, the fact that religious tension had somewhat diminished in England itself, made it possible for the economy to improve. The wealth of England benefited a lot from this period, and so did the arts. This period that would be later called the Elizabethan era or Elizabethan age. So very famous figures of the art like William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe appear. Not really because the Queen herself was acting like a patron of the arts. She respected them and somewhat supported them, but more probably thanks to this period of economic prosperity. Prosperity also woke up overseas ambitions for England that had almost entirely disappeared for more than a century after the end of the Hundred Years' War. In the 1580s, the colony of Virginia, probably named after her nickname, the Virgin Queen, was founded. Expeditions were also sent to explore the ocean, or sometimes to attack Spanish and Portuguese possessions and seize some of the treasures they collected and repatriated from the Americas or Asia. The most famous sailor of that period, who would also command the English fleet during the war with Spain and the episode of the Spanish Armada, I'm going to tell you about that in a minute, is Francis Drake.
The use of sea and air is common to all. Neither can a title to the ocean belong to any people or private persons, forasmuch as neither nature nor public use and custom permit any possession thereof. My mind was never to invade my neighbours.
Even though she always tried to avoid direct conflict with European countries, the war with Spain became unavoidable in the 1580s. The reason is that there was a revolt in the Netherlands, a Protestant revolt. As I told you before, the Netherlands back then were a possession of the King of Spain. The Netherlands were seeking to become independent. Elizabeth supported this rebellion financially and militarily, which led to war with Spain. Back then, Spain was a considerable military power, both on land and on the seas, putting England at risk of being invaded. This is the infamous episode of the Spanish Armada. Spain gathered the largest armada of that time, dozens of warships that were supposed to attack England by transporting an invasion army coming from the Spanish Netherlands. I'll probably make another video about that, so I'm not going to give you too many details today, but the idea is that thanks to a clever strategy of harassment, many mistakes by the Spanish army, and quite a lot of luck too, the Spanish Armada was almost entirely destroyed. Most of the ships were lost and only a minority of them made it back to Spain, with England spared of an invasion. Before the fight that finally did not take place on land, Elizabeth went to encourage the soldiers, and this is when she said her most famous words.
And therefore I am come amongst you at this time, not as for my recreation or sport, but being resolved, in the midst and heat of the battle, to live or die amongst you all, to lay down for my God, and for my kingdom, and for my people, my honour and my blood, even the dust. I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart of a king, and of a king of England too.
Another threat Elizabeth had to deal with during her reign was the existence of Mary Stuart, the Queen of Scots. I think I'll probably make another video, another biography about Mary Stuart one day, so I'll keep it short today. But the story is that Mary Stuart was the daughter of King James V of Scotland, and as I told you before, for centuries France and Scotland had been very close allies because they had interests in common. In 1558, Mary Stuart was married with the future King of France, Francis II. This happened just when Elizabeth was in her 20s, when she reached the throne of England. For a very short period of time, because Francis II died very young, Mary Stuart was the Queen of Scots, Queen of Scotland, and the Queen of France. After the death of Francis II, Mary Stuart returned to Scotland. She had been raised Catholic, and for dynastic reasons, she was considered by many English Catholics to be the rightful monarch for England. So she became, for at least a part of the English Catholics, a champion that should replace Elizabeth, the Protestant Queen, on the throne of England. In 1567, so this rivalry had already been in place for years, Elizabeth jailed Mary Stuart, who was her cousin, in connection with several assassination attempts, and Elizabeth kept Mary imprisoned for about 20 years. 20 years during which Mary Stuart never surrendered. She continued to plot and hope that one day she could dethrone Elizabeth and become Queen of England. Finally, after 20 years, Elizabeth agreed to have Mary Stuart, her cousin, executed, and Mary Stuart was finally beheaded. This shows you two aspects of her character. First, Elizabeth could be somehow indecisive at times, preferring to delay as much as possible the moment when she had to make a definitive choice and abandon her options. It also shows you that even though she would have probably preferred to avoid the execution of Mary Stuart, who was family, her cousin, and another woman, Elizabeth could be very tough and was not particularly more friendly with women. A concept like feminism was obviously absent in this period. It would be a bit anachronistic to look at these events with such an angle. But during most of her life, Elizabeth, even though she had nothing against women, was very well and apparently preferred the company of men. And she could be a bit misogynist sometimes. She once said, for example,
"There is no marvel in a woman learning to speak, but there would be in teaching her to hold her tongue."
Elizabeth was at the height of her power and glory at the beginning of the 1590s, when she was almost 60 already. The Spanish threat had been diverted. Mary Stuart was no longer a threat, and England was living in relative peace and relative prosperity. The later years, the final years of her reign, were more difficult, mainly because of economic difficulties, bad harvests, and inflation, unemployment led to a drop in her popularity. However, she remained the undisputed sovereign of England until her death in 1603.
All my possessions for a moment of time.
Aged 70, Elizabeth finally died in 1603 as a new century was beginning. having no children, she had chosen as heir the son of her former rival, Mary Stuart, who was the King of Scotland, and he became also King of England, King James I. Elizabeth was the last of the Tudors on the throne of England, this dynasty that had seized the throne after the War of the Roses. I will also put the link to this video in the description, the video I made about the Wars of the Roses. And her reign is immediately going to be remembered as a golden age, a period of prosperity, stability and consistency. Even though she had her flaws, she was sometimes indecisive, hesitant, and historians, especially in the 20th century, have revisited the legend a little bit and tend to mitigate it, explaining also that she had her share of luck during her reign. But you judge a tree to its fruits, and this period of stability that sometimes remains referred to as the Golden Age gave the arts a chance to blossom. It also re-established the status of England, laid the foundations of its future overseas in the following centuries, and maybe also because the period before and after her reign was less favorable, this period remains known as one of the best in English history, the Elizabethan age. I hope you enjoyed this little biography. This is just an introduction, of course, and there would be plenty more things to say about such a fascinating character. But this is all for today. Thank you again to Emma, WhispersRed, and I'll see you soon for another video. Au revoir.